Today it's my privilege to introduce Todd Smith. Now Todd is with the Olympia Parks Arts and Recreation, and I saw Todd, got the idea for the program because I saw this program listed this summer on the schedule at Mount Rainier National Park up at Paradise, and I thought it would be a terrific program for us to host here in Olympia. Todd has worked for Mount Rainier National Park as a seasonal ranger and also a volunteer coordinator. At one time he was also with State Parks. And before I talk about his program today, I'd like to tell you some interesting background on Todd. Todd is currently completing a PhD at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And his subject is a study of the comparison between American national parks and the national parks of England and Wales. So very interesting subject. And he also received a master's degree from the University of Glasgow. So that's an interesting side story to your professional career, Todd, and congratulations on your studies. Todd is going to be speaking today about how the Civilian Conservation Corps, the WPA, and other myriad New Deal agencies altered the landscape of Mount Rainier and Olympic National Parks during World War II and changed the way those parks are today operated and visited. So thank you, Todd. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the museum and to the program. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful, beautiful Monday. We don't get this many great Mondays in January, and I'm glad that you all chose to come in here instead of being outside playing, which is probably where I would be if I weren't here. First of all, I want to sort of say a couple of things. We're actually going to be talking about, the focus is going to be World War II. It's sort of the axis, forgive the pun, of World War II, upon which this talk hangs and rotates. We're going to be talking about the CCC, WPA, PWA a little bit, of course, as a precursor to World War II, and then some of the effects of World War II on the parks in later years, even continuing to today. So I also, this might be a little bit different from some of the lectures here, I'm not sure, but I would invite you, if you have any questions and we come to kind of a natural break in things, I'm more than happy to answer questions that you have during the program. I've given this program probably 20 or 30 times, so it won't really distract me from if you have any really compelling questions, you just need to ask right away. And then, of course, there will be time at the end as well. And if this does turn into something more conversational than just being a one-sided lecture, I'm perfectly happy for that to happen as well. So go ahead. We'll wait. We're not quite ready for the next one. National parks in World War II. Some of you might recognize this photo. Does anybody know who took this photo? I can already see. Oh, okay. This is, which national park is this? That's right. All right. This is awesome. I can tell we've already got knowledgeable people here. This is Yosemite Park, National Park in California. You know, the beautiful classic look of the valley. And this is one of the few pictures that Ansel Adams took with people in it. Most of you know that Ansel Adams didn't take a whole lot of pictures with a whole lot of people, and especially in his National Park series. But he was really, really moved by the interactions of military personnel, particularly in national parks. Now, these young guys in the Navy, you can see standing out, looking at the beauty of the Yosemite Valley. They were there for rehabilitation. Has anybody been to the Ahwahnee Hotel at Yosemite? Yeah. And you know, the Ahwahnee is this, you know, massive palace of elitism or whatever, and it's a beautiful place and everything. Well, the Ahwahnee was transformed during World War II, and it was changed into basically a place of rehabilitation for soldiers and sailors. So, although the wonderful fixtures at the Ahwahnee and everything were removed, and all the glitz and the glory of the place was kind of temporarily put in storage, the sailors commented on things like, this is the first time in 2 or 3 years that we have unlimited hot water. So they were quite pleased to be staying in a place like the Ahwahnee. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. Now, we have to talk, when we're talking about World War II national parks, in fact, I think any conversation around national parks in the United States really has to revolve around this guy. Now, I think there's a popular misconception about Theodore Roosevelt being really the national parks president of the United States. And it's true that he played a huge role in dramatically increasing the number of national parks in the United States. And there's one of the reasons that he's on Mount Rushmore probably has to do with that fact, among other things. I think most historians probably wouldn't list him in the top 3 or 4 of presidents of all time, but there he is on Mount Rushmore. But FDR, I think arguably, is the single person with one of his lieutenants who had the most influence, the most profound influence upon national parks, even lasting until today. FDR was elected, of course, by landslide in 1932. The Great Depression was in full swing, and Herbert Hoover, who was the president from 1929 until early 1933, had really started to try to get some relief things going in the United States. His efforts were really too little too late. The one thing we tend to think of that was a Hoover project was of course, the Hoover Dam, or as I guess maybe Democrats like to call it, the Boulder Dam. I'm not sure which is in use now. I think it's called Hoover Dam again. Of course, in March of 1933, that was when presidents were inaugurated back then, FDR becomes president. And one of the very, very first things he does is he starts to create all these alphabet agencies. And go ahead and next one, please. Now, there were all sorts of alphabet agencies, and I think the 2, though, that are probably the most famous in this country are the WPA and the CCC. Now, what does the WPA stand for? That's right. I love this audience. And then CCC, of course, is... Yeah, it's the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, there's another one that actually had a lot of. It was a fairly short-lived organization because it was part of the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, and that was the PWA. Now, the difference between WPA and PWA, and it gets kind of tricky here, is that WPA was under the auspices of the Department of Agriculture. And PWA was under the Department of the Interior. PWA, again, didn't last as long as it was part of NRA, and this is all going to get very confusing very quickly. But the PWA actually probably did more work up at Mount Rainier and Olympic National Parks than the WPA did. But the CCC was FDR's baby in a lot of ways, and it was an absolutely remarkable organization. I'm sure most of you probably know a great deal about the CCC, but we'll kind of do a review anyway. Starting in the summer of 1933, FDR's first summer as president, the CCC immediately went out and started sort of populating the forests of the United States. Now, the deal was they got about $20 a month, $21 a month, I think, which was about the same as a seaman in the Navy or a private in the Army at that time. The deal was, though, is that they had to give almost all their money back to their communities. So they had to send most of their money back to their families. And the idea was that that provided economic stimulus. It was sort of one of the first big economic stimulus packages. When we think about the CCC as being a conservation effort, that was really just a part of it. I think the economic stimulus part was just as important, if not more important. So who were the guys in the CCC? Who were the tree armies? Well, the CCC drew from a lot of different types of people. You had a lot of people from the cities. You had people from Seattle. You had people from Tacoma, Boston, New York. And these were people who were often not very well educated, if educated at all. They were jobless, probably. They didn't have much hope in 1933 of finding a job. And so they often enrolled in the CCC. The CCC was not diverse in some ways because there were a lot of people who were not allowed to join it at first. Despite Eleanor Roosevelt's counseling to her husband, African Americans were not originally allowed to be in the CCC, and Eleanor Roosevelt was not able to make her voice heard over the voices of some of the Southern Democrats who absolutely insisted that African Americans be excluded from the CCC in the early years anyway. So in the South and in parts of the West, a lot of the folks that were in the CCC came from very rural areas. But they were still largely uneducated, and they were people who really didn't have much hope for finding jobs elsewhere. You had a lot of second sons, you had a lot of third sons in rural areas who didn't have much hope of inheriting the farm, and this seemed like a really good option to them. The ages were, those varied a little bit too, but usually between about 17 and 24 or 25. I think 26 was the uppermost limit for the CCC. So you had that variety of things. You had three things. Number one, you had young men who were off the streets in the city. There was a fear that all these young, jobless men could cause real problems. CCC took care of that. You had conservation. CCC took care of that. And then you had economic stimulation with all the money that they were sending home. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Now, some of the things that the CCC did at Mount Rainier and Olympic are, most of the things that they did there are not things that people really think about now. When you mention to the average person, I think, in the United States, so the average person anyway who's heard of the CCC, I think they tend to think of really beautifully constructed camp shelters, really beautifully constructed buildings, not so much around here. That skill set just did not exist in great abundance for the enrollees of the CCC that were coming out here. And so they were used mainly for completing infrastructure projects. When I was a ranger up at Sunrise, one of the things that I constantly told people on our walks around the area was that if you walk on a trail here, if you use a water system here, if you use the bathrooms here, almost anything that you do here, any walk that you make, you can thank the CCC. Trail building in Mount Rainier National Park particularly was a huge, huge undertaking for the CCC. And the next one, please. And also the WPA. Now, I talked a little bit about the PWA, and they were actually the ones who started the blockhouse up at Sunrise. How many people have been to the visitor center up at Sunrise? Okay, a great number of you have. Okay, has anybody not been there before? You got to go up there. It's the best part of the park. I'm a little prejudiced. I'm an East Side guy for sure. Now, first of all, a couple words about the visitor center. A lot of people see it and kind of wonder what the idea was. Originally, the idea for the conception was that it would sort of be modeled after a Hudson's Bay Company trading post, and so that's kind of why it was built like this. Now, I think it's a little bit ironic that in one of the most sacred places of the people who became the Yakima Nation, that you would build, a blockhouse. I think it's actually, now when we think about it, I think it's a little bit offensive, but back then they didn't think that. They thought it was just, this is a Northwest icon, and this image of the Hudson's Bay Company at 6,400 feet was a pretty good thing to have. Now, if you, I'm going to step in front of this for just a second. Now, I'm a geek. I'm kind of a little bit of a geek when it comes to architectural history. So if any of you are as well, I strongly suggest you check this out. Right in this area, right outside the doorway here is the main entrance right there. There are some piers that come down, some short concrete piers, and this area here was actually originally intended to be a plaza area without the vegetation. The replanting of the native vegetation here was done later. Well, if you look at the piers right here, you can see little shims of wood coming out of the piers. And what happened is that the PWA and their original construction of those buildings actually walked away from the construction because the money went away and then the PWA went away. So you can see these little tiny things up there that can almost tell you the date of when certain things happened to this building. And that would have been in about 1934, 1935. This building here was the first building at Sunrise, and it was built, it was finished in 1930, 1932, and the whole thing wasn't finished until I think they finally finished it in like 1952 or something by getting all the money together. But this is really one of the few buildings. This is really one of the few buildings of major importance at Mount Rainier that was built by either the CCC or the WPA. If you could move on to the next one, please. And the CCC and the WPA, particularly the CCC, built much of the Ohanapikosh campground. If any of you have been up to Ohanapikosh before, it's the first place I ever went camping as a kid, and I worked there for a couple of summers as well. Before the CCC came along, campgrounds were really kind of a mess. What happened was that you went into an area, it was usually just kind of a broad open area. There weren't individual campsites usually. It was just you put your tent down wherever, you found some firewood or you chopped it down from a tree. And you know, when cars came along, people drove all over the place and trampled the vegetation and everything. And there was a guy named Meinke who came along in the 20s and 30s, and he had these ideas that he proposed during the Hoover administration. It was called Meinkeizing campgrounds. And what that was making them basically into the campgrounds that we know today, with individual spots, strategically placed comfort stations, and water piped in, and also big giant rocks along the road to make sure that people didn't drive off the pathways and everything. And you know, it was kind of a pipe dream to do this in national park campgrounds. Well, what do we have? All of a sudden, we have tens of thousands of young men who are providing this incredibly cheap labor for the federal government. And so that's what they did. They built these well-organized modern campgrounds that people are still enjoying today. Just the next one, please. This is a number I'd like you to really think about. We're getting a little bit closer to World War II now. In 1940, the National Park Service budget was $26.45 per visitor in 2008 dollars. So I want you to remember that in 1940, $26.45 per visitor in 2008 dollars. We'll get to that. Yeah, I don't want to give it all away yet. On December 7th, 1941, the United States entered World War II. And this, obviously, straight off the bat, is clearly in the United States going to be a huge, huge impact on national parks, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Now, when we think about Olympic National Park, we think about the history of war and Olympic National Park and what became Olympic National Park in 1933. There's one species of tree that we tend to think about, and does anybody know what that is? Spruce. Yeah, and specifically the Sitka spruce. There was during World War I, there was actually something called the Spruce Railway that some of you have probably heard of around Crescent Lake, and spruce was taken out and it was used for building aircraft. Now, starting in the 1930s, when they were talking about, in the late 1920s even, when they were talking about making Olympic National Park a park, and let's go ahead and go to the next one, please. When they were talking about making Olympic National Park a park, the timber interests on the peninsula went crazy. The original idea that they had was that Olympic National Park would be largely a mountain and glacial park, and that the lowland forests, which is where, of course, all the valuable timber was, that would be left open for cutting. Well, pressure was increased and increased and increased, and by the late 30s, it was up to a fever pitch. Every community on the Olympic Peninsula, in the newspapers, even the city of Olympia, Port Angeles, you can imagine Aberdeen, the newspapers were just blaring, giant land grab, the president's trying to take away our heritage and our children's, stealing bread from our children's mouths. By 1940, 1941, 1942, America's national parks, and specifically Mount Rainier, places like Mount Rainier and Olympic, were in grave, grave danger. This is a picture very near it's Olympic National Forest, very near the Olympic National Park border. The next one, please. Sitka spruce, as I was saying, during World War I, and this is a sort of a World War I era picture, was incredibly important for building aircraft. Well, what the timber interests latched onto in 1942 is that we need to continue to take out as much Sitka spruce as possible so that we can continue building airplanes. Well, how many airplanes were being built of Sitka spruce in 1942? Not very many. And the folks in the Department of the Interior, particularly Harold Ickes, who was the extremely aggressive, the Harold Ickes Sr., that is, the extremely aggressive, huge park advocate. I mean, this guy was a bulldog for national parklands, despite the fact that he didn't often enjoy them himself. He saw right through this and did his best to put a stop to what he saw as a big resource and land grab. Could we have the next one, please? But some of that land grab did happen, and through condemnation of whole stands of timber in Olympic National Park, with the help of some of Olympic National Park's too well-connected staff, a lot of trees were cut down in Olympic National Park. Huge trees huge stands of Sitka spruce and western red cedar and western hemlock were cut down. And the excuse was these are hazard trees. And the superintendent said that because they're hazard trees, these big stands of hazard trees, they need to be taken out. Well, they also happen to be very valuable trees. Now, one of the things it says in the Organic Act of 1916, the thing that they have posted up on the visitor center walls is for the enjoyment for the enjoyment of future generations, and they use words like unimpaired and wonderful things like that. Another part of the Organic Act of 1916 says that the superintendent or the secretary of the Interior can cut down trees just in case, if there are needs to clear vistas or, in case of dangerous trees falling on people or things like that. So this was used at Olympic National Park over and over and over again, even until the 1960s, when people around here really started putting pressure on local government to put pressure on federal government to try to put a stop to some of those things. Let's go ahead and go to the next one, please. Newton Drury, who was the wartime director of the National Park Service, was a man who was being shot from both sides. Drury was originally the head of the Save the Redwoods League, and he was the first National Park Service director who was from outside the National Park Service. When you look down the first 5 or 6 directors of the National Park Service, it was a clear lineage from Stephen Mather to Albright and Arno Kammerer and people who had all been there at the creation, the sort of founding fathers of the National Park Service. Harold Ickes and FDR decided that they needed to go outside of that and that they needed to find somebody who was really going to be a real advocate for the parks and not just an advocate for the image of the parks and the use of the parks. Drury started throwing things around like science, and instead of using terms like scenery, which was the key word in landscape architecture, it was all about scenery. It wasn't about natural resources, it was about scenery. And we conserved the scenery by doing things like killing predators and chopping down problem trees. Newton Drury kind of changed that, and he was sort of shot by, like I said, shot by both sides. The people in the National Park Service and the people in the timber industry didn't like him for doing this. And then on the other side, conservationists thought that he was not sort of militant enough for their tastes. And so conservationists weren't very fond of Newton Drury either. So let's go to the next one. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes was one of those people who was, he was kind of, an odd conservationist in a way like FDR was. Most of you know that FDR was, he wasn't paralyzed, but he was largely paralyzed below the waist. He had very little use of his legs, and yet he was a staunch advocate for national parks. Harold Ickes was, he was a very large man who enjoyed his cigars and his drink and his food and yelling at people. And he was not the kind of guy to go out into the backcountry or anything like that. But he was a staunch advocate for backcountry preservation, for wilderness preservation. And he stood behind Newton Drury, even though he didn't think that he was being tough enough. Let's have the next one, please. Now, some of the things that were happening at Mount Rainier as it wasn't just all resources being sort of under threat. There were also some pretty amazing things going on. up at Mount Rainier particularly, and at Olympic National Park, the 10th Mountain Division had a presence at Mount Rainier. Their presence there has maybe been overstated a little bit because they weren't, the park is very, very proud of the fact that the 10th Mountain Division trained there, but they didn't train there for all that long, and they were there for 2 winters, I think, and only parts of 2 winters. At that time, they were based in Colorado, and now, of course, the 10th Mountain Division is based in upstate New York. But they do have reunions every so often, and some of the guys, of course, there are fewer and fewer of them every year, but some of the guys will still come back up to Paradise and meet every couple of years. So, and the old cabins at Sunrise. This is a really interesting use of the park, sort of pre-World War II, and I kind of threw these in here as a little bit of an aside, but. The cabins at Sunrise there were a couple hundred cabins up at Sunrise, and they were just little housekeeping cabins, basically a place to sleep. Has anybody here been at Sunrise in early July before? Yeah. Well, the snow at Sunrise in early July is usually pretty high. It's not as high as it is at Paradise because it's on the dry side of the mountain. But imagine, the season usually opened on the 4th of July at Sunrise, and you couldn't get into the doors of most of these cabins. And so they eventually ended up taking them out. But if you go up to Sunrise now and you look behind the old, this is what's kind of called the Sunrise Day Lodge. And by the way, it's an unprotected building that could be easily torn down. So call your Congress folk, I guess. You can still see the scars on the hillsides from where these cabins were. And these cabins were, the last one was removed in 1942. So almost 70 years after the fact, you can still see the cabins. Now, I bring that up as an aside, not just to show you that there were all these things up there before World War II that were maybe not thought out very well, but also with World War II coming along and the CCC kind of ceasing to exist, all the damage that was caused by these things could not be fixed. If these cabins had been taken out 2 or 3 years earlier, then the revegetation of the meadows could have proceeded and things like that.
I asked a question.
Yeah.
Were those built by the CCC or
No, these were prefabricated and brought up. Yeah, and they were brought down the hill the same way. The only good thing that came out of these cabins is that they were, most of you know, I'm sure, that Tacoma and Seattle had a massive, massive shortage of workers during worker housing, I should say, during World War II. Places like Boeing and the shipyards in Tacoma and Seattle and even in Bremerton. And so these were kind of trucked down the mountain, which I would really like to have seen, actually, especially at that turn at Sunrise Point. But these were trucked down the mountain, and most of them were used as worker housing. They were crummy little, thrown together shanties. Basically, they weren't very nice. And other than this restroom and parts of the visitor center, those are the only buildings. Oh, and the pump house or the generator house down here. Those are the only things that were built by WPA or CCC up at Sunrise. Let's go ahead and have the next one. Yeah, and so there was a lot of military personnel and equipment up at Mount Rainier, and that's actually wrong. That's supposed to be Yosemite. That's another Ansel Adams picture, actually. But the military used it quite extensively, but they managed at Mount Rainier, and Mount Rainier had actually had really good management at that time, and they actually have really good management now too. But when Tomlinson, O.A. Tomlinson and Preston Macy, who were kind of traded off being superintendents at Olympic and Mount Rainier, when they were up at Mount Rainier during World War II, and they saw to it that the military's impact was pretty soft up there. They did a lot of training exercises. The 10th Mountain Division did a lot of training, but it was during the winter, so it was on top of all the snow. And even when they did have large military presence up in the summertime, they made sure that they kept largely to the trails, and they didn't do a whole lot of damage up there, actually. The next one, please. World War II also brought about not the very first park rangers who were women, but some of the very first park rangers, large numbers of park rangers up at Mount Rainier and Olympic National Park and all over the Park Service. Go to the next one, please. And two of those women were Barbara Hilton and Catherine Burns between 1943 and 1945 at the entrance station at Nisqually. Now, there's a really great story in the archives that talks about the superintendent of Mount Rainier National Park commenting upon the attractiveness of the rangerettes in their uniform. And my friends who are rangers there still, my friends who are women who are rangers there still just are constantly kind of bristling at that, as I'm sure these women did in 1943. But those attitudes were still there. With all the women who were available to staff the national parks, who were qualified to staff the national parks, as opposed to sort of Rosie the Riveter, there really was no Rosie the Ranger movement. There were women who were rangers in the parks, but it wasn't a resource that was utilized to the extent that it could have been, and it's a shame. The next one, please. Several of Mount Rainier's lookouts were actually used as aircraft warning systems during World War II. One of these is really easy to get to, Mount Fremont Lookout. It's just above Sunrise if you haven't been to the Mount Fremont Lookout. And when you go up there, you can see it probably was the only lookout at Mount Rainier that really could almost have served that purpose properly. But you have to remember that after Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of just sort of unknown that was happening. There were reports that the Japanese were storming the beach at Westport. There were reports that Long Beach Harbor was occupied and mined by the Japanese Navy. People really didn't know what was going on. When I was an undergraduate, I went to college at this small Presbyterian college in the middle of Kansas, and there was an aircraft warning station in the bell tower of one of the churches there, in case the Japanese Navy came roaring up the Arkansas, as they call it there, the Arkansas River, which never happened. But Gobbler's Knob is the other place at Mount Rainier that served as a lookout, and Gobbler's Knob's a little bit harder to get to now, but because of the West Side Road being not open almost all the way to Clapatchie Park now. But it's still not too bad, especially if you're a bicyclist. You can actually ride your bike up the West Side Road, put it at the Lake George trailhead, and then it's just about a few miles walk up to Gobbler's Knob. Probably not very effective as a fire lookout either, or as an aircraft lookout, but a really nice place. The next one, please. And we're going to go outside the Northwest a little bit, but this is something that really has to be talked about when we talk about national parks during World War II, and that's the imprisonment, and that's the term I use is imprisonment, because that's what it was at the camps. This is the one at Death Valley, actually at a place called Cow Creek at Death Valley. That's the headquarters of Death Valley National Park now. A lot of the Japanese Americans who were sent to these camps after Pearl Harbor, in the year or two after Pearl Harbor, were from this area. A lot of folks from Puyallup, a lot of folks from Auburn and Kent and the Seattle area, and a huge percentage of the population of Bainbridge Island. I mean, a huge percentage of Bainbridge Island went there. The next one, please. And here's sort of a layout of the Cow Creek camp. Have any of you ever been to Manzanar National Monument? Yeah, I go there about once every 2 years, and I literally cry every time I go there. It's just such a moving, when you see the monument up against the mountains and everything. It's an incredibly moving place. The superintendent of Death Valley in 1944, he was absolutely thrilled with the fact that he had this camp at Death Valley. And why was he thrilled that he had the camp? Because he said that the prisoners at this camp were the best workers, bar none, that he had ever had. Now you have to remember, these are people who, against their will, had been made to sell all their property, and some of these people had some pretty extensive holdings for pennies on the dollar. They were forced to leave their land, their families were split up, and they were sent to these, I mean, I love to go to Death Valley, but it's a horrible place. I mean, if you had to go there, and you were from here, which is, paradise to most of us, it's not a place that you'd want to have to go. The cold and the heat and the wind and the sand blowing all over the place. These are people who were betrayed by their country, a lot of them American citizens, treated like they were nothing, and yet they were still loyal. They got to this camp. They were still patriots. They got to this camp. They worked as hard as they could possibly work to make Death Valley a nicer national park. Again, it's an incredibly moving story, and I just ask myself all the time, if I were put in that situation, would I feel anger and bitterness, or would I feel like I still wanted to give to my country? I think I would probably feel anger and bitterness.
But the CCC built this, not because it's 38, they didn't know yet they were going to use it as an imprisonment camp. So what was it originally built for?
It was originally built, well, a large portion of the prison camp at Cow Creek was there, but it was originally a CCC camp. And that's why I have CCC up top there. This was one of the places, this was actually the main place at Death Valley for the CCC to go out and sort of radiate out. They also had spike camps all over the place at Death Valley. I guess where the, it probably wouldn't have been the best duty to be in the CCC at Death Valley either, I don't imagine. But do you know where, it's not far from Furnace Creek. It's just up the road from Furnace Creek. Yeah, it's maybe like 2 miles away. Yeah, that's where the park headquarters are. You'll see signs for the park headquarters. And there's not much left there, but there's an archive and a library there. And they're pretty, if you call ahead, they're pretty cool about, about giving access to folks if you express a specific interest in research there. Have the next one. This is Manzanar, right? Mm-hmm. And it's Ansel Adams. It just seeing the American flag standing in the middle of, and those weren't guards that raised that flag every day. Those were the prisoners who were raising that flag every day. If you ever get a chance to go to Manzanar, it's an incredibly moving experience. Just the next one, please. The staff during World War II at national parks was reduced by 80%. This was largely because of funding, but it also had to do with the fact that most of the men who were rangers, who were younger men, and a lot of them were, they went to war, like so many men did, and they just weren't able to be replaced very easily. Yeah, and that's a shame, because the women played such a huge role in wartime industry in the United States, and the reason that women were brought in to help out as rangers was because there was a huge shortage of men, but they weren't. There could have been so many more women working there, and it could have been. The parks didn't need to suffer as much as they did, but there was the same bigotry and prejudice that has existed for centuries, and good old boys clubs and everything in the National Park Service. So the budget was reduced by 80% as well. And the next one, please. Visitation was off by 66%. And the next one, please. And probably worst of all for the National Park Service, for the agency itself, is that it was moved out of Washington, D.C. for the entirety of World War II. You can see this is the National Mall, and it looks nothing like the National Mall looks now. These buildings here were all temporary wartime buildings, and the Defense Department and Defense Industries had absolute power to decide who was in Washington and who wasn't going to be in Washington during the war. Next one, please. So does anybody here work for the state of Washington? Or did, yeah. And does anybody, now Steve, I know you've certainly been stationed at some fairly remote areas. Does anybody not work near here for the state? Or has, this is a good example. I work for the city of Olympia, and I work at Priest Point Park. Now the center of power in Olympia is there are two places, City Hall and the Olympia Center for Parks. So I'm sort of isolated administratively and politically, which is probably by design. That's probably, Steve's laughing. They probably put me out there. They probably put me out there for a reason. But the more isolated you are from the administrative center, the less power you have, absolutely. And this was the problem for the National Park Service. They were housed in the Merchandise Mart, which is a really cool old building in Chicago. So what that meant is that they didn't have a large staff in Washington, D.C. Budget requests, nobody there to do them because they may have had one lobbyist in D.C. and that's it, maybe a couple of junior staff members. Late night calls to senators to speak to them or congressfolk or to the president never happened because they didn't have a presence in Washington, D.C. This hurt them severely. And you'll notice that they didn't move back in 1945. They moved back in 1947. So when all the sweet post-war contracts were going out and all the rebuilding was happening right after World War II, Park Service is stuck in the merchandise mart in Chicago still for 2 years. The next one, please. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, thankfully, World War II did end, and by 1945, and the summer of 1945, the war in Japan, or the war in the Pacific ended when the surrender was signed on the decks of the Missouri in Tokyo Bay, and things started to change again in the national parks. Next one, please. Park visitation increases dramatically. In fact, even a little bit before the war ended in 1945, and about late 1944, late summer of 1944, one really important thing happened that really dramatically increased visitation in the national parks. And can anybody guess what that was?
Gas was non-rationing.
That's right. Yeah, gas rationing went out the window. And so all these people who might be able to save their gas for a long time, maybe go up to Mount Rainier or Olympic National Park, they could finally drive again, and people could drive cross-country again. Now, one of the things about national parks that you have to remember is that in this area, Mount Rainier National Park and Olympic National Parks they're two of not very many big Western national parks that are within commuting distance or easy driving distance for day trips to big cities. And we have Portland, we have Seattle, we have Tacoma, the whole Puget Sound metroplex. You think about places like the Grand Canyon. Back in those days, not an easy place to get to from Phoenix for a day trip. Obviously Yosemite and Yellowstone, not really easy places to get to for a day trip either, 4, 5, 6 hours from San Francisco for Yosemite. And so people just started going back to parks immediately. But park funding definitely lagged way, way behind because of some of the things that I said about them being in DC. And national parks began falling apart. This is a photograph of, and I don't actually have I don't even know what park this is from, but it is from an old construction site that was abandoned in 1940, and because of a lack of funding, and then of course it didn't get any funding during the war, and so all this stuff was just left to sit there. And the hillside, you can see, is sort of starting to wash away, even though there were some basic efforts at trying to stabilize it. And this was happening all over the place. At Mount Rainier National Park, when the road was finally finished and sort of modernized and widened in the 1930s, the Rick Secker Road that goes between Nisqually and Paradise, there was debris all over the place. There were pictures of just debris and construction materials all over the place that were never really cleaned up, even when the CCC were there. They did most of it, but not all of it. That stuff stuck around for a long, long time after World War II. The parks were an absolute mess. Next one, please. The shelter at Indian Henry's, this is a really good example of it, and I'm sorry that this photograph is scanned in with 1999 or 2000 technology, so it's not the highest resolution picture. Things in the backcountry at Mount Rainier were absolutely falling apart. Now, some of these shelters had been built and rebuilt by the CCC, and some of them predated the CCC from, the early part of the 20th century. But campgrounds, shelters, everything was completely falling apart. The old visitor center at Paradise, and I don't mean the spaceship. I don't mean Henry Scoop Jackson's spaceship, but the old Paradise, what was called the Paradise Lodge, which was where the new visitor center at Paradise is now. That thing was falling apart. Paradise Inn was a mess. And facilities at Olympic were even worse. I mean, in the backcountry of Olympic, things that had been developed were hastily developed and were absolutely falling apart. So the next one, please. And so historian Bernard DeVoto, who is a wonderful writer about a variety of subjects, in Harper's Magazine in 1953, probably wrote the most famous magazine article in the history of the National Park Service called "Let's Close the National Parks." And a lot of people saw this as kind of a polemic, in the style of Swift's A Modest Proposal, but it wasn't. Devoto was dead serious. The parks were an absolute mess. Funding in 1953 was still lagging way behind. Only about 10 or 15% of the funding had been restored by this time, and you had massive growth in the number of visitors going back into the national parks, massive growth. There were millions and millions of people coming back into the national parks. There were no facilities to take care of them. The facilities that were there were just completely falling apart. The next one, please. There were the old style of National Park Service architecture. Sort of one of the terms for it is National Park rustic architecture, and the idea is that I think this is one of these things that was sort of arbitrarily decided. This is Cedar Creek Ranger Station in Sequoia National Park. It was built in 1917, but what this sort of architecture is, and I actually have a better picture on the next page to talk about this a little. Yeah, this is the classic example. This is the old headquarters building at Longmire, if folks don't recognize it. But it's this beautiful stuff that's supposed to be really really organic and really fit in nicely with the environment. Sort of along the lines of people like Frank Lloyd Wright, who wanted buildings that fit in with the environment and kind of flowed nicely. It's I guess sort of the national parks version of Prairie View style or something, but. So these buildings, they look like log cabins. I mean, they're made to look like 19th century structures, but the reality is they're not 19th century structures, they're 20th century structures. All of the log and the rock and everything is a facade on the inside and outside, and these are steel reinforced buildings, which is kind of nice now that we know, now knowing what we know about the seismic activity around Mount Rainier. But this was the norm in those times, and in 1953, these buildings, most of which had been built in the great building period of between about 1915 and about 1925, these buildings were just falling apart. They were an absolute mess, and there was nothing to replace them. And so the director of the National Park Service and the Secretary of the Interior and the President all decided upon to embark on a new program in the mid-1950s. And this is the El Tovar. We'll move on to the next one, please. And that was Mission 66, or as some of us like to call it, Mission 666. Might be a better name for it. Mission 66 was an idea that was started in 1955 to be implemented starting in 1956. And in 10 years, Mission 66 was going to bring great renewal to national parks. New buildings were going to be built, new hotels were going to be built, and new visitor facilities would be built, and this would just be an awesome, fantastic place, a fantastic thing. Well, what happened was that as so much architecture, mid-century architecture, and I'm an admirer of some mid-century architecture, but a lot of it's just hideous. I mean, not to be too judgmental, but a lot of it's pretty awful, and it certainly doesn't fit that organic, rustic style that the Park Service went for earlier. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. This is this is my favorite. The cyclorama at Gettysburg. How many people have been to this building before? A lot of you have. I mean, it's actually a very interesting building, and they've just redone it, and it's pretty fantastic. But the funny thing is they actually kind of used the Prairie View style of Frank Lloyd Wright. Sort of the sprawling one-story style, trying not to look too so it didn't look too put upon the landscape, even though it didn't have anything in common with the landscape. But it changed the whole idea of what the Park Service was doing, and it kind of brought more development in. And let's go to the next. And this is one of the classic examples of actually good Mission 66 architecture at Mount Rainier. This is the Ohanapikosh Visitor Center that was actually designed to fit in really nicely with the forest, and it does fit in nicely with the forest. And the next one, please. And this is our long-lost friend, the Henry M. Jackson Memorial Visitor Center. Now, these buildings, the reason I'm showing you these buildings and talking about World War II in the same sentence is that these are a direct result of the neglect that happened during and after the war. We neglected our parks. We neglected the facilities in our parks, and this is what we got. Now, I have a lot of affection, had a lot of affection for this place because I grew up there. I mean, you know, we were there every weekend in the wintertime skiing and, you know, a lot of weekends in the summer hiking and everything, and then I ended up working there as an adult for a while. But it didn't fit in with the landscape, and one of the very, very worst buildings, in my opinion, in the history of the National Park Service, and I'll tell you why. Paradise is the snowiest place on earth year after year, even though Mount Baker tried to usurp that title. And, we have a flat roof in the snowiest place on earth. That was great. And to combat that flat roof, there was a system of heating pipes and heating oil that went through the roof, and literally went through the roof, because in 2005, I think was the last time I worked in this building, or 2006, we spent, in one winter, we spent $200,000 on heating fuel. You have to remember, when this place was built, and this is one of the very last Mission 66 buildings built, by the way. When this place was built, finished in 1966, actually finished in 1967, the price of heating fuel was negligible. You could probably get a gallon of heating fuel for, 25 cents a gallon. In 2006, the price of heating fuel was up, close to $4 a gallon, where it kind of still is right now, $3, $4 a gallon. And so the price plus the environmental damage were just absolutely astounding. Now, there's sort of an apocryphal story about the visitor center. I'll just do this as an aside. I know we're probably getting short on time here. But the first place I ever worked for the National Park Service was at the USS Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor. And, absolutely fantastic place to work, but kind of a weird design. The same firm that designed the Arizona Memorial was originally awarded the design for this as well, this firm in Honolulu. Now, why do you choose a firm in Honolulu to design a building at Paradise? I'm not sure. But the story was that this was the original design for the USS Arizona Memorial, and the Navy said, And so the federal government said, well, we're going to let you build it somewhere, and Mount Rainier was the place that they chose to build it. Then they made up this sort of an architectural abstract about how it symbolized the mountain, and the ramps that went up symbolized switchbacks on trails. I don't buy it. I like the story. I don't think it's probably true, but it's kind of a good story. So let's go to the next one, please. Okay, again, we're going to review. In 1940, the National Park Service budget was $26.45 per visitor, in 2008 dollars. And here's the great one. In 2007, the National Park Service budget was $9.43 per visitor, in 2008 dollars. Now, between 1955 and or 1956 and 1966, capital budgets went way up. Operating budgets stayed the same or went down. We've seen that more recently too. You can go to Mount St. Helens and see the visitor centers that have been closed there because of the state parks benefited from that a little bit, I guess. But the visitor centers at the Forest Service had to close because they built these beautiful facilities and didn't give them any operating budget. This was happening all over the National Park Service too, and continues to this day to happen in the National Park Service. The nice thing is, for us here in the Northwest, at Mount Rainier anyway, the new visitor center was built with that in mind, was built with low operating budgets in mind, and was actually built to cost a lot less to operate than the old one was. So, the next one, please.
Are you comparing capital, are you combining capital and operating for those comparisons?
Yeah.
So they're totally different?
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah, the two things, when I gave that number, that's the total budget.
Capital and operating.
Capital and operating, yeah, $9.
Totally very comparable. Do you have operating for operating?
No, I don't. I don't actually. Sorry. Yeah, I don't actually know what the operating budget is right now, but it's not in real dollars. It's not anything like it was in in the 1940s and in current dollars. So
If you're comparing capital, you're combining them, so how do
I'm sorry?
You just said there's a huge growth in the capital construction.
Oh, yeah, in those 10 years, yeah, between 1955 and 1965. And I don't have that number for those 10 years either. But Mission 66, during that building program, there was a huge spike in capital budget.
So it might mean that the operating budget was bigger than it was.
It might have meant that the operating budget was,
Well, you're thinking maybe the operating budget was bigger back then than it is now.
no. The operating budget, I'm pretty sure, was not any bigger then than it is now. But we can talk a little bit about that. I'd have to get some figures on that to give you a definitive answer.
When did park fees come in?
Park fees at Mount Rainier came in 1899.
Right at the beginning.
And they really started coming in. Mount Rainier was one of the first parks that allowed cars into the park. And they've always charged, as soon as cars were allowed to come in, they had to pay a fee to come in. And adjusted for inflation, it was $1 to bring a car into the park. So it was a lot of money back then. Back in, that would have been in about 1919, I think. 1918 or 1919.
Before my time.
So, yeah. Now, the question is, what can we learn from all this? What can we learn from the lessons of all this activity before World War II, all this spending before World War II? The war comes, the parks are pretty well neglected, and then in dollar terms and in backlog of maintenance and things like that, the money never materializes again. The budgets never materialize to pre-war levels, not even close. I used to say in one of my talks up at Sunrise that something like the CCC was not going to happen ever again. That politically and economically, we probably wouldn't be in times when something like that would be possible. Never say never. I guess I shouldn't have given that definitive of a statement. But, the economy is not the greatest right now, and there are a lot of people out of work, and, maybe some lessons could be drawn from this, that some of that work could be done by something similar to the CCC. Can the next one, please? And one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is that what are our priorities as a country in terms of for those of us who love national parks. What do we support as a country? When the economy's bad and we have 2 wars going on, what are we going to support? Well, here's what Franklin Roosevelt thought about it, and his sentiment was echoed by a lot of soldiers coming back from World War II and writing him from the battlefield. In a very real sense, our national parks and natural preserves symbolize and embody many of the very ideals and objects for which our soldiers are fighting. And I think that's certainly true, and I wrote this program when the wars were a little bit more in the public consciousness than they are now. I think the public's become a little bit bored with war and doesn't want to think about it quite as much. But I think this quote by Roosevelt really brings home, for me anyway, the fact that our parks are very, very important. And for a lot of the people in the United States, the parks are among the principles of this country that are worth fighting for. They're worth giving priority, even in bad economic times. And I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you folks very much. And if you have any questions, please feel free.